All right. Sweet. Well, welcome. This is the March Eco Credit Builder Lab. Always the third Thursday of the month. I think next month there's some interest in looking more into climate finance. So I feel like there's just this growing hunger for more connection and dialogue and unpacking these friction points, these complexities. So I'm really glad that we seem to just be like digging right into it. For today, we're just going for the jugular with this one and digging into verification. And it's a topic that, I think it's a topic that's I think everybody has a different relationship to, and has, for Regen Network at least, has been something that through the Carbon Plus Grasslands work, we worked directly with verifiers on those projects and learned a lot through that process. And then since then have learned a lot working with all the different methodologies and projects, really thinking through like, well, what is the role of verification and what can technology and tools do around them? But I am really excited for today and to have Michael Musgrave on from Newton Natural Capital, and he's joining us as a special esteemed guest. We worked with him over the past year or so, communicating around working on different protocols as a verifier, and was just extremely impressed with not just the expertise, but really like the care for trying to unpack all of this around verification. How can we improve this? What are we missing? How can we work well together? So I'm going to spend just a minute talking about really like high level verification, what we are even talking about, spend a minute around regen, what our thinking is around verification, what we're trying to dig into and build around, and then pass off to Michael, to give him some time to really share about his deep expertise, his understanding of verification, and kind of related to a lot of different sectors, and really like us getting to sit with his observations because a lot of times within our space and within the EBLs over the past year, it's been pretty one-sided. It's been on the project development side. And so this is an opportunity for us to have that kind of more of that open conversation, with an actual verifier, with someone who's like in the weeds on that side of things. So let's dig in by I wanted to sit with this image that there's a lot going on for a reason. I didn't make this image, but it's like all of the different entities. And this is within carbon credits, but we think more broadly about the ecosystem, service credit market, very much the same. We've got all these different actors and all these different relationships. And the role that some of them play, if we think about a lot of folks here are sitting in that project developer camp. And the third party auditor, that verifier step, is like this on ramp, really, this like this vehicle to legitimacy within, the space to get towards carbon credit buyers. What we feel are those tension points for a project developer to work with a verifier, and then for what, to be able to like have that finance come back to project developers, kind of what's lost along the way. So I thought this was a nice way for us to just sit with the complexity of the space, and that there are a lot of different actors involved. There are a lot of opportunities for growth, but also for like friction points. So we'll be sitting right with kind of that third party verifier space. Now at Regen, we think so much about claims verification and really trying to build around what we see as, instead of kind of pointing a finger at like all the things that are wrong, trying to innovate around those tension points. One of them is kind of like what we've done to date and what our thinking is around kind of the role that we can play in supporting efficiency and innovation and credibility. And one of those things is, we're working on taking all of the different requirements that are in the protocols and methodologies and in the registry, the program guide, digesting those requirements into checklists and tables where it's really clear to see whether or not the evidence that has been submitted meets that requirement, so that everybody's on the same page. Everybody sees the same thing. Even the verifier and a buyer, they can see how different requirements have been met in a credible and transparent way. Another way that we're digging in around verification is utilizing our newest tool, the data stream, which is there's a screenshot of it to the side there, where a project is able to make posts around, they can be posts around like monitoring reports, camera trap footage, um, registering for a new project and credit issuance, and utilizing that as a way of having a document trail, really like a chronology of documentation, and then being able to even digitally sign those. So imagine if a verifier is able to digitally sign a project document, and all of a sudden we've got a lot of different stakeholders that are kind of participating in the verification process in a very different way than we have seen historically. And the last thing that's really at work right now is a group of folks that are working on building out taxonomies and really exploring data schemas so that we have this foundational layer of clarity where when we're talking about impacts and benefits, we define those within taxonomies. We have a clear data schema, these ontologies that allow different types of data to kind of all render the same, to all have kind of a shared language that they're using as we have all these different types of data types coming up. So the way in which we're thinking about this, and I think have a nice image as we're thinking, breaking down what verification is in our minds. It's like we're making a claim about something, whether that's a carbon claim or a biodiversity claim, or an impact, a more broad impact claim. And we're saying like, okay, there's a certain piece of evidence that goes with that claim, and there's a certain party or stakeholder that's providing that evidence. And then there's this other stakeholder or party, we can imagine in this instance, a verifier, who's attesting to that evidence. So if we're breaking down the process into this flow chart, we can start to think about like who's involved in the process? What does a claim need to have alongside it? And how does that need to show up in a way that can be legible and credible? And then like where we're looking in the future is just opening this up more and more to where it's just very easy to access this information. It's very easy to see who did what when, where this evidence is coming from for a particular claim, getting right to that documentation, trying to open things up in a way for all parties involved, for there to be clarity and transparency. So, and then like continuing to work on next steps with the working group and building out more of these ontologies and taxonomies for everyone to be able to dock into. So that being said, in terms of like the world of verification in Regen's mind, I'd like to pass off to Dr. Michael Musgrave from Newt Natural Capital. He has decades of experience, and he's been working in the world of wildlife and environmental conservation. He has been in the world of carbon integrity, carbon capture and storage, and working deeply with technologies around data capture, analysis, and monitoring. So we have someone just steeped in a lot of the work that we are all doing and playing the role of really like a credible layer to all of this work. How do we bring this to a market in a credible way? So I'd love to pass it off to Michael and stop sharing my screen. And there you are. Go, Michael.
Thanks, Rebecca. Thanks very much. And it's 7 o'clock in the evening where I am, so I'm going to say good evening to everybody, but I'm guessing that it's morning for most people where you are. So good morning to everybody there. Just by way of background and introduction, I am South African, born and raised, and kind of had a lifelong interest in the environment, and followed that through with, you know, my undergraduate university studies, all the way to merging with a master's degree in African ecology, and ready to sort of launch into a career in this industry, and then very quickly became quite disillusioned with how things get done. And I guess most of that disillusionment was about the fact that these guys never have any money to do things properly. And so I chose not to get involved in the industry for quite a long time, until the early 2000s, when carbon suddenly became a possibility for earning income in a wildlife conservation project that reflected the reality on the ground, that we were, by conserving large areas of land, that we were acting as a carbon sink, which was a service that we were providing to the planet and to the international community, that could be charged for, and that we could get some proper money into these projects, rather than depending on handouts and charity and philanthropy. So I got involved with my first carbon project in a South Central African country called Zambia, in 2006. And this was kind of right at the beginning of the voluntary carbon market sort of emerging as a real force. And I couldn't have timed it worse, to be honest with you, because the 2008 financial crash came along, and that just wiped out carbon as a viable resource for, I guess, nearly eight to 10 years or something like that. A long time. But even while we were working on this project, I really was uneasy about a lot of things. One of the verifications that we were looking at was FSC, for which is a timber verification standard for sustainable forestry. And the people coming along to do these verifications at that time were from a company called SGS, a global verification services company. And the person coming along would be capable of verifying just about anything. He'd go quickly be sent to a shoe factory to verify a manufacturing process and certify against an ISO standard suited to that industry, as he would come, you know, to certify an FSC forestry project in a pretty remote area of southwestern Zambia. And of course, you know, when it came to the biology of these forests, when it came to understanding how this ecosystem functioned, I knew a lot more about it than he did. And it became quite clear to me that all he was doing was really a sort of a box ticking exercise, you know, ticking off certain procedures that we'd been through against a list of requirements for FSC certification. But the thing is, we paid him a lot of money to do that. And we kind of accepted it. Well, it's part of the process. This, you know, we've got to get this certification, and we've got to get through this, because, you know, we had although it was a it was an integrated land use sort of project where we were doing wildlife conservation, some sustainable timber harvesting and wood production, as well as hunting and harvesting of wildlife, to really sort of maximize the income or revenue generating potential from this land. So it was an important piece of the puzzle, so that we could sell our timber into markets that valued sustainable forestry, and it was a cost of doing business. So fast forward a few more years, and carbon picks up, and carbon becomes more widely applied, or the sort of methodologies and the standards become more well established. Your VERRAs and various other standards organizations, each of which have got a slightly different take on a methodology. And then, the project cycle that Rebecca showed, I've also got a slide similar to yours, Rebecca, which I also didn't make myself, but it looks almost exactly the same. So, there's a well-trodden path through a project development phase for a carbon project, and you'll notice on the top of Rebecca's diagram there was a big arrow that said third-party verification. And so in the ensuing years, I became accredited as a third-party verifier for under ANAB, under the American National Standards Organization, which is essentially applicable to VERRA and various other of the global carbon standards. And I've worked on several verification exercises for forest carbon projects in Europe and in Africa. And I guess my unease has never quite gone away. And I'll tell you why. Those of you who have followed this space for the last few years will remember that, where are we, 2024, that 2023 and 2024 were not good years for the forest carbon or the land use carbon sector, because of a series of reports that came out that essentially claimed that 90% of these credits were worthless, and took the worst examples possible that these reporters could find, and then painted the entire industry with that practice. But the thing is, they actually had a point in that there were some really bad projects that had, on the one hand, overestimated their abilities to produce change in vast landscapes in Africa, overstated their logistical capabilities, and not really taken into account of the context, the culture, the people that they were working with. And it really just almost blindly applied a methodology from VERRA or from Gold Standard or from wherever they were registering, and had been third-party verified. And so, those projects, some of them, had their credits wiped off the various registries. They essentially collapsed. The first carbon unicorn, the South Pole Carbon, has essentially been reduced to a fragment of it, of its former self, and most of the senior management have been, I'm not sure on the details, but I would guess they've either resigned in shame or have been told to do so. And so the question is, how did that happen? If third-party verification is the gold standard for integrity for these projects, why were all of these projects that were clearly lacking in integrity able to become third-party verified? Now, for me, there's two answers to that question. One, there was corruption involved, and they had third-party verifiers who were simply paid a large amount of money to sign off on what they were looking for. Or the other answer to the question is that this process of third-party verification is deeply flawed, and you can get a good verification without having a good project. And I think the latter is more closely aligned with what's actually going on. I guess I'm going to stop and see if there's any sort of questions, or anyone wants to come in and just question me, and then I'll carry on and suggest, if this process is flawed, what do we need to do to address some of the problems? Happy to take any questions.
If folks want to raise a hand, happy to move around. Anything comes up. As people are thinking, getting into like the reasons that you see as to why verification is flawed.
Yeah, let's carry on. If there's no questions, I'm happy to carry on. So there's sort of a bit of a mythology around third-party verification as to how it sort of works, and I guess that's because it is wrapped up in, you know, all sorts of standards and verification requirements that have to be met before you can become accredited as a third-party verifier. Now, the conventional route is that you set up a company and implement a management system. Okay, what's called a management system, which is basically lots and lots of documents that outline your procedures. Okay, and that management system uh, uh, is checked against an international standard, an ISO standard. In our case, the ISO standard would be 14,064 Part 3. And once you've set up your management system, you've written out all your documents. These are documents that say, you know, how you handle disputes and what your formal procedures are for a site visit, and very, very detailed. You know, it really lays out in exhaustive detail how you approach a verification. And once you have all these templates and these documents in place, you can then apply to ANAB, or in the United Kingdom, it would be the United Kingdom Accreditation Service, or UCAS. And lots of different countries would have their national accreditation agency. The carbon industry, by and large, uses the organization called ANAB, which is an acronym of an acronym, which is very confusing. So the American National Standards Institute Accreditation Board is what ANAB stands for. And so ANAB will then review your documents, charge you a huge amount of money, and eventually that you will become ANAB accredited. So once you're ANAB accredited, that is your license to operate. They review your expertise. It's pretty exhaustive. I mean, it's not an easy process to get done, and anyone who is ANAB accredited, I think, you could be assured that is a credible operator. And the same goes with many other of the national standards that you might find out there. And so the problems with the accreditation then are therefore not the credibility and the qualifications of the people who are doing the job. But I think there's a more fundamental problem, and that is that the documents against which you're accrediting are the methodologies, right? The various methodologies that are issued by the various standards organizations. Now, these methodologies, if we were to take, for example, the VERRA improved forest management methodology, which I think is VM0044, that is a methodology that you can apply in Vietnam, Zambia, Brazil, Ecuador, Tanzania. It's a globally applicable methodology that can be used by a carbon project anywhere in the world. It is simply impossible for a standard that is aimed to achieve what it's designed to achieve to take into account anything to do with local context. And, you know, for me, local context is everything when it comes to many of these land use projects. And you know, forgive me for, you know, not addressing a sort of more industrial carbon processes like direct air capture and various other processes. My expertise is very much in the land use sector, so my examples will mostly come from land use examples. But so inherently you have a methodology that is not going to take into account a lot of local context. But the third-party verifier, the only power that he has, and this is regulated, by the way, by the ISO 14064 standard under which you operate, The only power that you have is to check that the methodology has been correctly implemented in a project. You are, in fact, not permitted to provide any kind of advisory information as during your third-party verification, because that would be viewed as a conflict of interest. And so, as a third-party verifier, you simply have a copy of the methodology, you have a copy of the project design document, and you have a field visit. And you reconcile what the methodology says against what it says in the document and what you found in your field visit. If the project has done everything according to the methodology, the project becomes third-party verified. It's as simple as that. It's a very mechanical process. And in fact, other than the field visit, when it comes to the documents themselves, I see no reason why in a few years this couldn't be done using AI. Especially if the PDD was written, in some sort of template format. This should just be run through an AI checker to make sure that it aligns with the methodology. It shouldn't be human beings even doing this stuff. But we're not quite there yet. When it comes to the field visit, fair enough. There's a human component that comes in there in terms of the verification on the ground. I don't see that being easily replaced. So, there's this problem of the mismatch of the methodologies which are designed to be applicable globally, but we know that in land use projects that there's a lot of local context that needs to be taken into account to determine whether a project is delivering a quality product. The other problem that I see all the time is that the quality of the science that gets done in terms of the GIS, perhaps even the remote sensing work, really is not taken into account by the methodology. And so remote sensing, to the layperson sounds like a solution to everything, that you can just get a few detailed pictures from a satellite. If you've got some money, you pay for even more detailed pictures, and that'll tell you everything you need to know. And if you can get a few pictures every year, you'll be able to figure out exactly what's going on the ground. And that despite the advances that we've seen almost every few years in remote sensing, that's just simply not the case. Okay, we cannot automatically. It's not a substitute for a human being looking at what's happening on the ground. There's all sorts of issues around, the reflectance values of the image and what they actually represent on the ground. There's error involved. There's an acceptable amount of error when you classify your images, and then there's errors that are too high. It's a very, very detailed, complicated subject, and I'm not going to really go into a lot of detail here now, but methodologies don't really speak about the quality of that science. This requires, someone with that kind of background to actually go in and check. But of course, that's not your remit as a third-party verifier. Your remit is to check against the methodology. So you're faced with that problem where, if you have a lot of experience, which I do, it's very frustrating to go to a project where you are required merely to tick off the application of the methodology, but you can see that there are major problems in the project, and you're actually not allowed to say anything because that would represent advisory work and a conflict of interest. So I see there's some comments coming through in the chat box. I haven't had a chance to, let me just have a quick look over that. But if anyone wants to come in, I'm happy to stop a bit there as well.
I think this is a good pause stop, especially, Mike, our interaction was very much around that last scenario that you were describing where you're caught within your mandate, and then the project developer is caught, kind of within within their world. They're trying to they're trying to implement something on the ground within like the real variables that they're dealing with that are
Mm,
outside, many of which that are outside of their control. Or, in the instance of, when we were working, we were talking about regenerative agriculture and what the implications of certain requirements were for these farmers, that it just wasn't possible. And it was so interesting to see that play out in real time,
mm,
because because the desire on the verification side is there to like, okay, well, how can we improve the methodology? How can we
mm.
improve the project? But if you are constrained, then it does seem like that is a pretty fundamental mismatch.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I mean, just to address the comment from I think it's Ramon in Mexico, who says that verification should not focus on charging and money-making schemes for third-party companies with headquarters in continents far away from the ecosystems being managed. I mean, in principle, that's a good point, but Ramon, the fact is that it's a very slow and detailed and laborious process, this third-party verification. It really is. If you're doing it according to, a VERRA kind of standard, it's weeks and weeks and weeks of work, and highly detailed work, and it requires a sort of a minimum level of experience to be able to implement, and those people are expensive. So weeks and weeks of qualified people working on these documents costs money. And the companies try and reduce the costs by employing perhaps less experienced and more junior staff, but ultimately it is an expensive process by its very nature, and and to be honest, it doesn't really pay that well in the end of the day. It's the perception, of course, is that it's very expensive and that they're paying money to all these companies, but it really doesn't pay massively well, particularly in land use projects. Yeah, if you're doing a verification for like a carbon capture and storage, where there's just a few calculations to verify or something like that, that's different. But land use verification is costly under the way that it's done. So just to address that, then I'm just scanning through the
Will you
comments here.
scan for a second, Howard, and then Forrest? Howard, do you want to pose the question that you had? Give him a
Sure.
second.
My question really has to do with drawing an analogy, if it's proper, between the methodologies and the ISO standards that underlie them. Sorry, trying to get my video on, and and the rules of evidence, that the idea of having very well established um, definitions of what qualifies as truth. And I ask this because I'm drawn to a concept that doesn't fit the verification model of following rules of evidence under the regulations of the of ISO and this standards of the methodology, to something that's colloquially called ground truthing, where there is a room there for judgment and for sensory estimation. And I'm just sort of curious if you could reflect on that, because my background comes from having been a legal professional and been very tied to rules of evidence and fact finding and interpretation and close adherence of regulations. And somehow, when it comes to work related to the land, to agriculture, to forestry, to conservation, there's a bit of truth about the sensing the ecosystem and its health and vitality that seems to be missing in the way that these methodologies have evolved. I'd be curious about your reflections on that, and whether there's a possibility to have a credible and a system with integrity that moves toward ground truthing, where the
Yeah. Thanks for that question. I think it's a really important question. It's a situation I found myself in from time to time, and I know, for example, there's certain signs or certain species which, when I see them in an African ecosystem, because my sort of majority of my experience is from South Central Africa, the savanna and woodland ecosystems in Eastern and Southern Africa. If I'm in one of those ecosystems and I see a particular bird species that we call a ground hornbill, I know I'm in pristine habitat. I just know it. Those birds require huge home ranges. They are dependent on other species and dependent on nesting sites that require old growth forests or lots of old dead trees, to be able to nest in. They're just an indicator of really good ecosystem and good habitat. I could think of a few more species, but that's just an example, I think, of what you're talking about, is that as our experience as ecologists and environmentalists, we get a feel for what an ecosystem should look like. And I mean, I've mentioned a specific example, I guess, that you could measure quite easily, but there's a whole lot of measures out there that you can't measure that easily. Now, how do you translate that experience and that sort of feel? I mean, I also look out for springs, sort of South Central and Eastern Africa is pretty dry environments, but in a good habitat, you'll always find a spring somewhere that's got some water. In the depths of the dry season, there'll be a spring, maybe tiny and hidden in the grass somewhere, but it'll be somewhere where antelope come and drink in the driest of dry seasons, because the water is being stored in the soil and being slowly released. Those natural sponges are all working properly. That tells me that I don't need to even look at anything else. This habitat is working. This ecosystem's working. So there's these signs that you see, Howard. But how do we assemble that into a verifiable tool that can be that's not just your opinion, that's a scientific evaluation of ecosystem function. And to be honest, as ecologists, we're actually completely useless at this kind of thing. We don't build tools. We don't transfer our knowledge easily across to non-experts, and our experience remains and dies with us a lot of the time. In addition, I've cited the problem of the lack of training in ecology and the lack of field experience that we see amongst a new generation of people who call themselves ecologists, but might never have spent much more than a week or two, out in an ecosystem. So I don't really know the answer to your question there, but I recognize the problem in the same way that you do, and I think a lot of work could be done around operationalizing that and building the tools and the metrics that we would then be able to use. But of course, then it's context. Every context is different. Every ecosystem is different. I wouldn't dream of being able to, walk around in a South American or Central American ecosystem, or a North American ecosystem for that matter, and know what the hell was going on. I wouldn't. I would depend on somebody else for that.
Well, I guess in that regard, and I very much appreciate your response. I think you got to the heart of the issue and translated it to the conditions that prevail in this space. And I'm wondering if there's a place-based way to do that, to I don't know if the right word is democratize, but to get all the stakeholders to agree. The folks who are investing, the folks who are working, and the larger community that's depending on the success of the project to agree what that looks like.
So I think, I don't know, but I think the answer the where we might be heading is indicated by some of the work that we've been doing with Regen around a soil carbon project, which is using artificial intelligence together with remote sensing to fill in the gaps, as it were, when it comes to measuring soil carbon in agricultural projects. Now, that's a very simple application. It's not a natural ecosystem, but if we can get that right, and we can get the simple stuff right, and AI and remote sensing starts improving, then maybe we can start developing those kinds of tools for more complex ecosystems where, you know, the signature that we get from the remote sensing, and let that be all kinds of remote sensing, visual, you know, all the spectrums, the different wavelength spectrums, maybe some LiDAR scanning and some sound recordings, or eDNA, or, you know, whatever it is, this massive data stream coming into an AI tool that then produces an assessment of that ecosystem. That's the way I imagine it going. I mean, I understand that we're nowhere near that point yet, but we certainly have all the pieces in place for the first time ever. You know, I never thought you know, when I was a young ecologist, you know, we'd do sample plots. You know, you'd go out and do a sample plot, and you'd do 20 sample plots, and that's how you got a sense of what was happening in an ecosystem. Well, it was just ridiculous, really. You know, you're talking about, you know, in areas that we work in Africa. I mean, my study area for my PhD was the size of Belgium. You know, so and I always imagined that if we could just sample this whole damn thing and put it through some thinking tool, some science fiction based computer that we could then spit out an answer. Well, we're nearly there, you know, is the truth. And I think that might be the way we go. I don't know.
We've had Forrest who've been awfully patient. We've got a question from Da Vinci community.
Sure, thank you. And first, I'd like to just start with gratitude, Becca and Mike, for this session that we're having here. It's such a clear, deep dive into this direction. And, you know, I've had the honor and pleasure of meeting Gregory Lando back in 2017 and really following Regen Network from the side for quite a while. So the last discussion was right on in terms of the direction of what I was wanting to ask about, because clearly you've laid out a really important problem, which is, you know, the early legacy groups like VERRA and things like this. It is enormously complex, and it pushes an awful lot of people that would want to be doing this work or wanting to be accountable in a good way really can't even consider it because of the costs and the complexity of it. So I guess my question was, or is, what is happening relative to Regen, relative to you, relative to AI? Is there an opportunity to support and participate? Is there a team that's been developed? Because I know we have a very powerful ecosystem of folks that are both on this call and people that I know that are directly connected with Regen Network and Regen Foundation from other groups that I'm participating in as well. So that's trying to get current of kind of understanding where is that process today? Where do you imagine it 12 months from now? And how is it that any of the people that might be here or listening to this might be able to support the work that's happening to move it even quicker?
I'll go first, and I think Rebecca might have a better oversight on this. But there's certainly a lot of dissatisfaction with the way that the things are happening currently, and that complexity that you mentioned, the context and the need for local context, all of that, and the cost, right, and the time that it takes to get all this stuff done. You know, VERRA looking at like 2 years before you can get a verification done or something. So there's a lot of dissatisfaction in the industry, but everyone's too scared to kind of make a big move, and it's going to take, companies like Regen who are pushing the debate, backing it up with verification technology like blockchain, these tools that do provide us with integrity and with accountability, to I think build up a critical mass. These things, you're often a lone ranger for years on end, and then suddenly the industry kind of turns, but if more of us speak out, and more of us are in a considered way, voicing our concerns about the inadequacies and the barriers that the current system of verification places on these projects, then I think we just build that up to a critical mass and be confident. Say it confidently. Don't be intimidated. Don't be intimidated that the current process provides very much at all, because it simply does not. That it is deeply, deeply flawed. And I say this all the time, and people are quite shocked, to hear that, because third-party verification is seen as this gold standard, or this threshold that has to be crossed, and once you cross that, then you're on your way to selling your first credits. Well, that's how it works in a technical sense, but in terms of a quality and integrity sense, that's really not how it works. So I don't know if that answers your question, Rebecca. I don't know if you've got a perspective on it as well.
Yeah, very much. I think that's the fundamental question in many ways that we wrestle with and think through as we work with individual projects and as we're developing the software to try to support them. And really the what's clear to me, and what Mike was referring to in multiple comments, was that because this can't be a square peg round hole situation with verification and methodologies, what kind of tools can be created that can be both flexible and expressive of the impacts and the values and the measurement and outcomes that are coming from these projects, while also being credible and legible and rigorous. And that dance is something where I think we as humans, when we think about rigor, we think about rules, like give me clarity, give me rules, give me a box. And instead, nature is not a box. These ecosystems, you can't put them into, like Mike was saying, you can't measure all of the things as much as we might keenly want to. And so what we think a lot about at Regen, and within especially the tool that we have now, for instance, the data stream, is that within this one tool, a project can put forth their evidence, they can put forth whatever claim that they're making, and that evidence should be able to speak for itself. And so you get a bit of a combination of like participatory verification, where if they're using evidence in the form of geotagged photos of what happens on the ground, and they are attesting to that, and then you have someone else maybe coming in to attest to that, someone else from the ground, someone else that's using remote sensing. If we can provide that level, like that, if folks can dock into that tool, then we're not trying to fit everyone into the same system. We're creating a system in which people can express it for themselves and state it for themselves. What the blockchain does beneath that is create that immutable layer to where no one can tamper with it, to where you have the level of auditability that really we're not seeing elsewhere. That is what is really exciting to us, is to allow all of the different iterations and expressions to take place while still allowing for the credibility that is needed. The one missing piece that we need to continue to dig into is who's on the other side, who's actually looking at all of this evidence. What are these different buyers, or different, these different groups that we want to fund this work? What are they looking for? Because that's also what needs to be expressed. Like, are we going to all of this effort when we don't actually need this evidence or that evidence? So I think that's another kind of, if we're looking back at that initial diagram we had at the beginning, where we have the project developers on one side and then the buyers on the other, and there should be more of a continuity of understanding between these different groups.
So if I could, just for a quick little follow-up on a couple things. One, just make sure that you're all aware of the work of Carbon A-List, which is doing it, Christopher Joffrey, which is just incredible. And I don't see has a big following at this point, but really into the science of everything you're talking about. The other thing I wanted to mention as a result of being very active here in Colorado is the state of Colorado is in the process right now of actually going to be giving state tax credit starting 2026 for regenerative ag practices. So to me, this seems like potentially an opportunity of at least conversation where you're moving some very leading edge activity, which is what Regen Network and Foundation and everything is, into the practical, right on the ground, working with states potentially that are actually wanting to keep track of this information. And they're doing it based on a practice base. So you do this practice, you evidence this practice, and you get X amount of tax credits that you can apply as you're doing it. So those were the only couple things to add into here as possibilities. I guess the one last one is, in my mind, I don't even know whether it would connect or not. We have a 23,000 square foot schoolhouse that we're converting into affordable housing units that are going to be net zero energy. So we're producing and storing and potentially managing gray water. All of that has carbon benefits. Obviously, overdoing it naturally. We have no idea how to measure it or get any value or anything. So it's just not even in our ecosystem right now of thinking, because we're really in the focus on what do we have to do to build this really wonderful location. So.
Thanks, Forrest.
Yeah, just to pick up on a point that you brought up as well, Rebecca, you know, we have other ways of providing integrity and rigor. You know, that it's called peer review. You know, there's a whole body of knowledge that gets generated that doesn't have third-party verifiers coming and checking it. It has a system called peer review, and you know, within those systems, if we move away from, you know, the natural sciences and have a look at how social scientists, you know, anthropologists and political scientists verify their claims of knowledge. You know, a lot of what they use is triangulation, right? So if you're getting the same results from 3 different people, you know, the chances are that that's actually what's going on, is the sort of simplified version of that. So, you know, there's definitely room for different ways of providing rigor and integrity in terms of claims that are being made that don't involve necessarily a formal third-party verification process.
No, thanks for that. That's a great point. A lot to be learned. Gregory, thoughts? And then after this, we're going to do a quick check-in to see if folks want to spin out into anything else. But Gregory, go ahead.
Yeah, well, this is a very vibrant and important conversation. I just wanted to speak to a couple of, I guess, Forrest's questions about, you know, what's happening in Regen Network's world and kind of how to engage a little bit. I'll try to keep myself from philosophizing too much. Although I just want to start by kind of just applauding, Mike, your really detailed on the ground critique and focus on innovating. And I think it very much resonates with my experience before founding Regen Network and around certification, essentially, and like the how broken it is. And I just want to note that there is a significant body of empirical peer-reviewed evidence pointing to participatory guarantee systems and peer review systems as producing much higher quality outcomes vis-a-vis verification, and that centralized certification coming from outside bodies, which is the norm. I just completely agree with the critique that that as a process is the problem. It's not as if any of the actors using that process are themselves somehow, corrupt or bad. I sort of see an entire industry with good intentions that's failing to provide the outcomes and trust that's needed,
Although perhaps
essentially.
a lack of skills and expertise would be, could be firmly laid at their door rather than bad intentions. But there's profound
Maybe.
lack of expertise in this industry.
Well, yeah, right. Because what's being demanded in the current paradigm, what's being demanded is expertise in box checking. And so the schooling and in order to qualify for those positions, the kind of expertise that one must demonstrate is not a deep place-based knowledge of a specific context or a trust graph, a demonstrable trust graph with a local community of actors, right?
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, you as a project developer, I could fly into Mexico tomorrow and start a carbon project and be third-party verified without much problem whatsoever, despite never having visited Mexico.
And this
We
is the
see the same
shift.
thing in Africa all the time, Every aspirational carbon project developer in the world has stuck his foot in Africa somewhere. And some of them have set up projects that are issuing credits and, they've been through that whole process. So I guess that's what I'm meaning about expertise, is expertise on the project developer end as much as expertise on the verifier end.
This is
and sort of everyone can just exist in this third-party methodology space and everything's fine, and it just isn't.
Well, this is the shift that needs to be made. And I guess this gets to the sort of like to answering Forrest's question. I'm going to answer it in two ways. One is just a call for mutuality and support and engagement. Because what we're trying to do is flipping an entire paradigm on its head from centralized, essentially colonial process in which power and trust move through lines of power and control instead of moving through lines of relationship and context. And
I agree.
if we're going to flip that paradigm, and this has been the hardest thing about related to Regen Network, is that perpetually, as people start to build their expertise in deeper relationship with communities or context, what ends up happening is people spin out of relationship with community and end up trying to found their own parallel divergent process in order to compete in the marketplace. And so we get this, like Regen Network becomes this flywheel that is spinning out instead of concentrating and cohering innovation that actually results in a paradigm shift at the market level. We end up spinning out sort of like innovation actors that then get trapped back into the existing market dynamics. And so the one thing I'll say, about this question of, what's happening, what's needed, I'll just say the recent turbulence in both carbon markets and the macroeconomic and political system, I actually think is starting to shift that a little bit. Is like the incentives at this stage are no longer, oh, go do it yourself. They're much more aligned towards we need to build in community and we need to create a commons and we need to create a trust membrane and relationships with one another at a higher degree. And so I'm heartened by that, although I wouldn't have wished for the conditions that are making that true. And then in a very concrete way, I think engaging with bringing projects into the registry system, engaging with the data stream projects, and engaging with publishing and working through open methods of crediting, which is the theme of this call. Just like saying yes to those processes in community and watching and creating a virtuous cycle as different people innovate and engage and share information and share ideas and share what's working and what's not working, I think is the antidote to this sort of purely abstracted, expert driven. We're going to rely on other people to tell us how to achieve trust between counterparties. So I think this call, attending this call, and then engaging with, you know, and it is a heavy lift for us. I mean, this is part of the problem. The heavy lift of you know, and Coalition Carbon Trust has gone through this cycle. There's so many people in this call that have gone through the cycle of saying yes to something that's beyond our ability to deliver, which is to ask the question, what would it look like to get the viable group of humans to agree on the ecological outcomes and practices that are needed, and then flow resources according to that system of agreement together, not ask, you know, what do other people think about that minimum trust circle, right? But to answer, what do we as a group of local stakeholders believe about the local trust sort of graph and relationships? And, you know, I'll just say there is really interesting parallel work in California to what you were talking about vis-a-vis state subsidies and taxes. So we've been working with Zero Footprint for years, and they are actively using Regen Network's tools for exactly what you're talking about, which is practice-based payments and reporting. And so there is an existing community, I guess I would say, because we're trying to subvert this paradigm of there's a central, and this is a very challenging thing to do as a business, but because we're trying to subvert this paradigm of there is one central store of truth and it is us, right? That's the way to compete in the current marketplace. That's not what Regen Network is about. If we were doing that, we would just be perpetuating the same problem. So that makes this ask that I'm making, this sort of sales pitch, all, you know, all the more important and really hard, which is for this to survive and for us to together shift how this is happening. We really do require individuals and communities to lean in of their own accord and answer this complex set of questions on your own, instead of waiting for someone else and sort of, you know, drafting off of their best practices in a way. And I think we're just on the cusp of establishing essentially sort of a network effect where it actually starts to become, because of the tools, because of the community, because of the vibrance, it actually becomes easier to engage and answer the questions on your own than it would be to pull off the shelf an arcane ISO certified methodology that places trust back into these centralized lines of authority. So that's kind of a few my 3 cents.
I agree with everything you've said, and if I was to summarize it very simply, I'd say, you know, that system is so bad anyway. It's so weak that really, to advance, in my mind, we need two things. We need people who are prepared to buy our credits, and then we need a robust, multidisciplinary system of integrity, of claiming integrity and rigor that would stand up to any third-party investigation that takes place. And again, referring back to the formal system of third-party verification, it is so weak that it shouldn't be too difficult to set that up, you know. So I think if you got those two things and you continually reference the weaknesses in the formal system, not many people who could criticize what you're doing.
Thanks for that summary. I want to give some time. I know Nina and Giselle, you all have questions, but I do want to make sure that for the project developers and kind of originators in the room, that you all have some space to ask questions as well. So just taking a brief pause, because we have about 20 more minutes. I think we're like really rolling with a larger room Q&A. Do any project developer folks have questions for Mike? And feel free to use chat if that feels more comfortable for you. Just want to make sure that you all have some room. Okay. Yeah, Giselle and then Nina. And again, please feel free to use chat if you'd like to ask more questions.
Oh, just a few reflections based on everything we have been hearing. Thank you, Mike. This is really enlightening, and and helpful also to feel that we are not alone in our way of perceiving and thinking. One thing that I keep wondering, and I think we are all trying to kind of, as Gregory was saying, shift or flip the paradigm here, is around the usefulness of verification. Like in the first place, what I think, coming from the academic world and as a scientist, I think that if there's enough reputation or knowledge in the monitors, there shouldn't be some verifying body that it's also charging for redoing all this stuff. So it has to do with reputation. It has to do with following the science. And as you were saying, it doesn't matter how rigorous is the verification. If there are flaws in the methodology in the first place, or what it's being tracked, if we're not comparing in the right way, for instance, with the natural ecosystems to see and level set where the projects and how they are comparing to what it's supposed to be functioning there, if we are not bringing all the science and technology in order to create good protocols and make those as a recipe that can create replicable projects and things that are auditable, then the verification is just as, it could be a recipe of, okay, you need to check with a thermometer that it's a digital one and it's the highest quality thermometer. So you go and check as a verifier, but the temperature, it was not the right parameter, essentially, right? So one thing that we're trying to do with this kind of, collective approach of methodology creators and decentralization of the verification, kind of, as we say, the progressive verification, creating some modular aspects that can be tracked and audited. We are trying to generate transparency on how the things are being measured and trying to create better digital, machine readable, for the use of artificial intelligence as well, machine readable protocols that can be then improved faster and also create kind of modules, things that can be audited by different experts and don't require a centralized body. So more than happy to hear about this and feeling like the community is all in the same page. It feels great.
Yeah, I mean, I agree, and what I have suggested as a solution to this problem is that there's a missing layer in that diagram that shows the project development cycle. That there's a missing layer in there which comes, in fact, either before or after the third-party verification, which is an advisory type verification, which is done by people with the correct expertise, as well as expertise in the local context. That would be a very simplistic approach to addressing the problem, and I think the work that Regen is doing is far more sophisticated in terms of establishing a completely different paradigm for verification, which I think is important but quite challenging. But if you were to just put one improvement into that project development cycle, it'd be to slot in a qualified and experienced advisory role, and have that company or group of people verified not according to their technical verification skills or their management system or any of this other stuff, but in fact for their local expertise in that particular environment or that particular habitat or in that particular species that's being used. So yeah, but to be honest, I think a paradigm shift would be better, but it's of course much more difficult to achieve that.
Ramon, your question, and then Nana after. Sorry.
Thank you so much. This is my first time I participate with you, and I'm really loving it. So my question is like, from the point of view, regeneration is like more than carbon. as you may know, is like social impact, biodiversity, water, etc. So my question is, it's very difficult to measure one thing. So how to measure 4 things or 5 things, and verification and monitoring? So my question is, how to develop these protocols in which you do not only focus on one like carbon credit, but rather you try to integrate biodiversity, carbon, water, social improvements in one same certification. Is it possible? Is it just a dream? What are your thoughts? What are your insights on that? Especially when we are talking on one piece or one same piece of land, which is kind of more difficult.
Yeah, it's a problem that I recognize very, very clearly, because in environments that I work in Africa, people are everywhere. There's always people, and there's always implications for people. And by managing for carbon, we cannot avoid but consider biodiversity, because the functioning of these systems depends on the biodiversity that we have, but we have no way of really accounting for it. I think there's 2 parts to your question. The one part is sort of how do we go about measuring this stuff. The other part is, which I think you're asking, but you didn't really ask clearly, was how do we monetize it? And the big advantage we have with carbon is that we can measure it conceptually. The carbon cycle is a very simple description of how we are making a contribution by capturing carbon dioxide and storing it in trees and soils. And it's 1 ton out of a factory in Germany and another ton absorbed by a forest in Brazil. And conceptually that works as well, because it's 1 atmosphere that we're dealing with. So it's a very simple concept with a very clear metric that no one's arguing about. No one's arguing that 1 ton of carbon is not a good measure for measuring the decrease in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere that we are trying to achieve. But when it comes to biodiversity, at my last count, I think there's over 30 different organizations working on some kind of metric, and I have to say the word, although I don't like even saying it, and that this biodiversity credit, which when I ask someone about that, everyone's saying it, but whenever I ask someone to explain it to me, they can't. And when they do, or they try, I don't understand it, and I'm an ecologist. So this challenge of metrics, and then when you add in water and various other services that come out of managing a ecosystem for carbon, I don't know that I have the answer. Other than the first answer that I gave was that somehow we take the a multiple range of things we can measure, like sound and camera traps and eDNA, and we can measure the water flow in a stream. We can measure soil water content, or anything that we have the ability to measure cheaply and at scale, and have that analyzed by this black box called AI, and then some sort of answer comes out of that. That's the only way I can think about it. I can't think about it in any other practical way and give you an answer, because I just don't know. I don't know what the answer is. I don't know how we make a biodiversity credit. I don't know how you package biodiversity in an instrument that can be traded and sold. I don't have the answer. And I don't think anybody does, but there are a lot of people who think they do.
I think that there's a lot that we could dig into there. I want to recognize that we have about 10 minutes left. And I think it would feel good personally for me for us to sit with and synthesize some of the kind of like opportunities and ideas that have been shared, and kind of look forward. After Nena, after you ask your question, if we could shift into forward facing. Go ahead, Nena.
Thank you. I think I agree with a lot of things that were shared today, but upstream of verification, there is like project planning and understanding like how a particular methodology is being crafted, who is involved in setting the standards for that methodology, and how does it really function, and what is the ownership and governance structure of that project looking like. These are often things that are never addressed in a conventional verification system. And the thing that Regen Foundation has been a little bit like putting their heads together is in like understanding how do you find ways to attest to an integrity of a project without actually directly jumping into the burdensome and big cost solution of appointing a third-party verification body. Like, is there a way upstream of that where this can be done? And one thing that we have been curious about is to like actually, with the help of DAO tooling and blockchain, actually like demonstrate that groups have the autonomy and the power in which they make credible decisions and how that directly associates with the impact that is being generated. I'm not saying that this basically like removes the role of third-party verifiers in the picture. Of course, there is going to be a point where they need to step in, but how to increase the complexity of it incrementally. So the question I have is like, of course, how do you see in the conventional space is the appetite for something that we're calling social MRV that basically concentrates on the process of how these things come into place? Who owns the land? How are decisions being made? Who is responsible for setting the standards? What is and how is the methodology being deployed? Is there a way we can also understand the culture and basically the ecological knowledge that you were sharing about, like looking at the hornbill in the forest that tells you that this is a pristine place that you've been in, like translation of that knowledge into things that are happening. Like, is there an appetite in this conventional space for something like this?
Yeah, I guess I could tell you about a tool I developed just over a year ago now, where we took the core carbon, the 10 core carbon principles from the ICVCM, which in themselves are pretty simplistic. But what I did is I took those 10 core carbon principles because they're quite good as they cover kind of everything in a very superficial way. But I put those 10 core carbon principles on each of them on a tab in a spreadsheet. And then under each of those, I developed sub-criteria around issues of governance and issues of community participation and a scoring system, between 1 and 3. So 1 was bad and 3 was good. Where you would then use the spreadsheet tool and you would say, okay, let's look at governance, right? How many women are on the board of the carbon company? Is it less than half, or more than half? And then you score 1, 2, or 3 based on that. How many community meetings were held to inform the community of what is happening on their land? Is it once a year, once a quarter, or never? How many people attended those meetings? Was it, a representative sample of the community? Was it dominated by elites? Was it just the usual faces that pitch up at every meeting? So I forget the exact criteria, but you can see where I'm going with this is that, under those 10 core carbon principles, you could flesh out some very detailed ranking questions, which you could then rank as to the degree to which the project was adhering to those criteria. And then you could end up with a score and say, for example, the perfect score would have been 50. You could then say, okay, this project scored 48, so it was pretty good, or this project scored 12 out of 50, and it means it's very bad. then start to get a handle on where you are with meeting some of those quality criteria in a project. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, but that is a tool that I developed that was designed to be used in very different contexts around the world, and had, I think by the end I finished it, must have had nearly 200 different criteria under each of the 10 core carbon principles. And not all of those criteria would have been applicable in every case, but.
Was that like something that you built for somebody, like an organization that they use it privately, or is it a public tool?
Well, we use it internally here at Newton Natural Capital to inform our advisory work. So we would be asked to come in and do some advisory work, and we would have this tool that, is obviously, this is our IP, and so we've kept it internal as a tool that we can then use to sell our services and our assessments.
And the last question would be like, how do you collect, if it's appropriate to ask, like, how do you collect this data to do the assessment?
We start off with your project design document. So some of the questions can be answered by a detailed reading of the design document. We would then interview the project developer and their management team, and try and answer some of the questions we couldn't find in the design document. And then we would like to do a field visit, ideally, where we go in on the ground and try and answer some of the final questions that can only be answered by a field visit on the ground.
Okay, that answers my question. Thank you.
And then you end up with a score. We based our scoring system on the Michelin star standard, so you can be a 1-star, 2-star, 3-star, or no star, and that would give you some indication of quality and integrity in a project.
Before rounding things out, we have a question that kind of relates a bit to the biodiversity comment that you had before in chat. Do you see it as feasible to replace field measurements of socioeconomic and biodiversity variables with remote sensors in projects where biodiversity credits are issued? So a bit of that answered previously when we were talking about biodiversity crediting. Or would it be viable to build capacity within communities for the verification and reporting of these variables? Or would the cost make it impractical?
Well, I always think you need to do both, because the one provides scale and the other one provides buy-in and community participation and support and social license. So, I've been saying for years and years, this idea that you can sit in an office in London or New York with all your clever satellites and monitor a carbon project is a pipe dream, not because it's technically impossible, because, and the question I always ask is, say, for example, you had a swimming pool in your backyard and there were water restrictions in your local town and you weren't allowed to fill up your swimming pool, but secretly just did it at night, And then a few days later, someone came and knocked on your door and said, listen, we've got this satellite that's been watching you and your swimming pool, and we know that you fill up your swimming pool at night. How would that make you feel? Pretty pissed off, huh? That you're being watched by a satellite, by someone sitting in an office far away. Well, that's how Indigenous people feel as well. Okay, exactly the same. So, I'd say you need both for that reason, because the tech allows you to scale, and the people allow you to get the local buy-in and social license and legitimacy for operations.
Thanks for that. So I feel like we've covered a lot of ground, and just really appreciating how like the problem space seems to have I don't know, is full full of different problems to try to solve. It seems like, part of it is like the fundamental nature of how this industry has been set up, the larger industry, and how verification fits into it. Therefore, like our solutions have to be kind of part looking at the foundational paradigm shift, and then part looking at what can we do now? What can we build now? So just to round us out, I mean, what excites you? What opportunities? What potentials? What are things that you within the realm of natural capital or beyond? Where are you seeing solutions and opportunities?
You mean, more generally in the sort of environmental space or in carbon, or what's your
I would say,
focus, I guess?
I mean, anything within anything that strikes you, because I don't feel like we're seeing as much movement and solutions around verification within the carbon space.
Yeah,
So if
yeah.
anything across the board strikes you.
I'm going to sort of keep coming back to this AI potential and how quickly that seems to be growing in various applications. And I mean, that's kind of aligns with some of the work that you're doing already there, Rebecca. And I'm really excited to see how that work starts developing and starts producing, the metrics that we need to be able to translate this into a financial instrument of some kind. I'm not sure that would necessarily need to be a unitary credit of any kind, but a set of metrics that are rigorous and have integrity, and that buyers are confident to invest in. I mean, some of the work that I do, I'm currently in Mauritius, and we're working on Mauritius has basically got no forest left. The only bit of forest left that they didn't cut down to plant sugarcane is in the mountains, and there's about 6,000 hectares of forest there, and it's a complete and utter disaster. It's invaded by South American invasive species and invasive animals from Madagascar. It couldn't be more of a mess if you tried. But given that it's small, and these small projects are much easier to manage than bigger projects, I'm seeing a lot of developers sort of stepping back and say, let's do this thing. Let's be the standard. Let's go so far and above what is required by VERRA or gold standard, or that in fact we redraw the landscape in terms of quality and integrity and how we get these projects done. And I see that as quite pioneering, because there's one way to get rid of a standard, and that's just to blow it out the water and just say, you're not even close, guys. We're not interested. Yeah, we'll do your VERRA methodology if you want, but that's just like one step in our project development process. So a few dedicated and pioneering project developers who are taking that approach, and I really like that. And that's some of the work I'm trying to get done here is to say, let's do this small little project to the highest possible standard that we can, and just redefine what good looks like.
I find that particularly moving and relevant, considering that it really does take a roadmap. An example provides a roadmap as to just, is it even conceivable? How could we do it differently? Because we are kind of so firmly entrenched in the processes that we currently have, the standards that we have on all sides of the spectrum. So I will be keenly watching and hoping that really comes to fruition. I am very grateful for your time. Laura, I see you here as well. Big kudos to the Natural Capital team for just charting a new course. And I'm excited to see what you all do and build and continue to collaborate. I feel like this is one of those moments where we can kind of just actually, it really, to me, is these like small moments where we can dialogue and unpack and see each other as people trying to do good work in the world. I think that's how we make this change in these incremental moments. So I appreciate everybody's time and willingness to come together and share learnings and just keep that forward momentum. You all can follow Newton Natural Capital's work, find them on LinkedIn, and we'll continue the conversations through the Hilo group that's linked out in chat as well. And we'll see you next EBL. I think it's going to be around climate finance. So related. It's just a whole big messy picture that we get to dig into and solve. But thank you all for your time. Thank you, Mike, very
Thanks,
much.
Rebecca. Good to see everybody on the call. Bye.
Thanks, everyone. We'll share the recording out. Take care.